One private company once ruled a subcontinent, richer than most nations combined. Its private army grew bigger than Britain's own, seizing kingdoms for shareholder profit. From one narrow street in London, clerks commanded a de facto Indian empire. Ancient native dynasties were pushed aside as company armies seized their lands. How did one trading firm conquer the richest region on Earth? This is the true history of the East India Company's rise to power. Before 1600, only Spain and Portugal held true overseas empires. England, France, and the Dutch wanted colonies too, but their treasuries were empty. So merchants in London and Amsterdam pooled money into new joint stock companies. Investors funded risky voyages, then split the profits if the venture succeeded. The Muscovy Company, founded in 1555, traded first with Moscow, but London's real prize lay further east, India, China, and the East Indies. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, tea, and silk could fetch more than their weight in gold. In 1600, London merchants petitioned Queen Elizabeth I for a royal charter. The Governor and Company of Merchants trading into the East Indies was born. Before we go further, subscribe, because the next few minutes change how you see money. Now here's where it gets interesting. The first voyages targeted Malaysia and Indonesia, not India, but the Dutch East India Company and Portugal already dominated those very waters. Stiff competition crushed the fledgling English company's early profits almost entirely. Therefore, by the 1610s, coastal Indian rulers began granting limited trading concessions. In 1639, the company bought land and founded the colony of Madras. Madras became the company's first major foothold on the entire subcontinent. In 1661, a royal marriage gifted the Portuguese colony of Bombay to England. The company quickly established itself there too, expanding its coastal trading network. By the late 1600s, multiple coastal colonies anchored the company's future growth. The company avoided the Americas, leaving those monopolies to rival trading firms. But it entered the African slave trade almost immediately, a darker side of empire. Slaves were purchased from Mozambique and Madagascar, not the western coast of Africa. The Royal African Company held western slaving rights, so the route shifted east. Slaves were shipped across the Indian Ocean instead of the Atlantic. Forced labor filled the company's factories and workshops in Madras and Bombay. Cheap forced labor boosted shareholder returns thousands of miles away in London. Rivalry with the Dutch curdled into open war between the two nations. Surprising part, for decades after that war, the company grew only modestly. The Dutch remained larger, richer, and far more aggressive traders throughout. But everything changed in the next century through outright military conquest. Robert Clive joined the company at just 20 years of age. By the early 1750s, Clive commanded senior military operations in India. The company had already recruited thousands of British and Irish soldiers of its own. Alliances with smaller Indian states supplied reinforcements whenever conflict loomed. Clive then turned this private army directly against the Nawab of Bengal. 1757, the Battle of Plassey becomes the turning point of the entire story. 1757. A small British force, backed by modern artillery, stares down tens of thousands of Bengali soldiers at Plassey. But superior rifles and cannons shatter that vast Bengali army within hours, a technological gap deciding everything. Therefore, victory at Plassey hands Robert Clive control of Bengal itself, one of the richest provinces on Earth. The company shifts overnight from scattered trading ports to something new entirely, the ruler of real territory. Clive's successors keep pushing outward, swallowing one conquered province after another across the subcontinent. But small native princes and Nawabs pay the price, their kingdoms erased one treaty at a time. Yet three great powers still block the company's path: the Mughals, the Marathas, and Mysore. The Mughal Empire still rules much of northern India and modern Pakistan, ancient and formidable. The Maratha Confederacy dominates the center of the subcontinent, a loose but powerful alliance of warrior states. And the Sultanate of Mysore stands as the dominant power in the south, wealthy and heavily armed. France pushes its own influence in the south too, operating from its stronghold port at Pondicherry. Then 1756, the 7 Years' War erupts between Britain and France, and everything changes. A war fought across the entire globe reaches Indian shores directly, dragging local rivals into it too. Clive seizes the moment, halting French ambitions in India for good, and clearing the company's biggest rival. What follows is nearly 50 years of almost constant warfare against India's remaining native powers. 4 separate wars are fought against Mysore alone, beginning in 1767, each one bloodier than the last. Those wars against Mysore grind on relentlessly, not ending until 1799, decades of unbroken conflict. To sustain this endless war machine, the company hires tens of thousands of native soldiers called sepoys. By 1800, this private company employs over 200,000 soldiers under its own banner. That single corporate army now outsizes the standing forces of many entire developed European nations. With that force and superior technology, the company finally seizes Delhi itself in 1803. Maratha resistance lingers on for years afterward, but company dominance over India is now effectively assured. By the early 1800s, one company alone controls all of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. A private corporation now governs hundreds of millions of subjects, more people than most kingdoms on earth, but enormous profits flow only one direction, straight into the pockets of shareholders sitting comfortably in London. The company holds a total monopoly on every scrap of British trade flowing in and out of the region. Every single cup of Indian tea drunk in Britain passes through this one company's hands. And from the 1750s onward, the company also taxes millions of Indian subjects directly, on top of trade profits. But commercial triumph masks something else entirely: catastrophic failures in the company's actual governance of the land. 1770, the Bengal famine strikes, killing roughly 10 million people across northeastern India. The company's inept handling of the crisis turns a bad harvest into a mass catastrophe. 1772, Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of Bengal, files a damning report on the failures. London's directors ignore it completely, chasing only the bottom line and next year's dividend. The company's ambitions reach far beyond India too, stretching all the way into China and Japan. Both nations try sealing themselves off entirely, refusing contact with European traders at almost every port. But a widening technology gap makes that isolation impossible to hold on to for very much longer. Opium, grown across India, becomes the company's single most profitable export of all. China pushes back hard, seizing opium stockpiles and threatening dealers with execution under the death penalty. 1839, Britain answers by declaring outright war over the opium trade itself. The First Opium War pits the ancient Qing dynasty directly against one trading corporation's private power. 1842, the war ends with British forces seizing Hong Kong Island outright as the spoils. The Qing dynasty is forced to abandon its isolation entirely, reluctantly opening its ports to European merchants. 2 centuries. That is all it took for 3 coastal trading posts to become an empire ruling nearly the entire subcontinent. Armies, treasuries, courts commanded from one office in London. But nothing in that rise prepared the company for what came next. In 1857, the whole machine nearly shattered in a single year. A widespread native rebellion erupted against company rule that year, and it did not stay contained to one province for long. Decades of excessive taxation had quietly built the fuel for this fire, squeezing farmers and merchants across company territory long before the match was struck. Therefore, dispossessed princes, stripped of their thrones for decades, saw one last chance to reclaim the kingdoms the company had annexed out from under them. But the revolt did not hit every region equally. Bengal and the old colonies of Madras and Bombay stayed largely untouched by the chaos. But around Delhi, company control collapsed entirely within months, its officers fleeing garrisons they had ruled unopposed for generations. Worse for the company, its own native sepoy troops turned their rifles on their employer, joining the very uprising they were paid to crush. The Indian Mutiny raged for well over a full year, far longer and far bloodier than the company's directors back in London had ever imagined possible. Over 6,000 British civilians and company employees lost their lives before the fighting finally burned itself out. Therefore, the true cost was staggering. An estimated 800,000 Indians died, not just from battle, but from the famine and disease that followed in its wake. That death toll proved something London could no longer deny. The East India Company was no longer trustworthy, nor even capable of governing a nation of millions. So in August 1858, Parliament passed the Government of India Act, and the mightiest corporation on earth was stripped of its own empire by law. Every territory the company had conquered over 2 centuries transferred directly into the possession of the British Crown overnight by a single act of law. India would now be ruled directly as a formal part of the British Empire, no longer as a private business venture answering to shareholders. But losing its empire did not mean the company vanished overnight. Its corporate shell, strangely, kept breathing for 15 more years. The state absorbed its land holdings, its civil service, and its private military, folding what had been a business empire into the machinery of government. The reason the company survived on paper traced back to an 1833 agreement, one clause of which blocked Parliament from dissolving it outright. That deal guaranteed shareholders a 10.5% dividend on their shares every single year, no matter what happened to the empire itself. That guarantee ran for 40 years, meaning the company could not legally be wound down until 1873 came around. So in that strange interim, the company that had once ruled a subcontinent spent its final years simply managing the tea trade. Then in 1873, Parliament passed the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act, finally closing the door the 1833 deal had held open. The East India Company was formally dissolved, its shareholders paid their final compensation, and the most powerful corporation in history quietly ceased to exist. But the company's end was not India's end of foreign rule. British governance over the subcontinent continued for another 70 years. Not until 1947 did India, alongside the newly created Pakistan, finally win full independence from the empire the company had first planted. So here is the real lesson. A private corporation with its own courts, currency, and army grew so large that it became too big to be allowed to keep existing. And that is the golden thread running beneath this entire story. Money, once it commands its own army, stops asking permission from anyone. It began with a simple mechanic, a joint stock company, let ordinary strangers pool their money, sharing the risk of a single dangerous ocean voyage. That mechanic alone built trading empires across the globe, decades before any government thought to intervene in how those profits were made. But once that private capital armed itself with soldiers and cannons, it stopped competing with the state and started rivaling it outright. Profit without accountability produced the Bengal famine, endless colonial wars, and an opium trade that devastated millions who never held a single share. The very same corporate structure that shipped tea to London also shipped enslaved people across the Indian Ocean and opium into China. And once granted that kind of monopoly power rarely surrenders its territory willingly. It takes an act of law or a war to pry it loose. Every corporation, it turns out, grows until the cost of letting it continue finally outweighs the profit it generates for those in power. Therefore, look at today's mega corporations spanning finance, energy, and technology. The same gilded thread of unchecked scale still runs straight through them. Before the next thread, subscribe if this changed how you see money, because the mechanic behind the headline never really goes away. So ask yourself which modern company you think holds comparable unchecked power today, one with reach that rivals the governments meant to oversee it. Tell me in the comments which corporation worries you most right now, and why you think it echoes this same old mechanic. Subscribe for the next thread, where we follow this same golden mechanic into the modern battle over the world's reserve currency. Next time, the currency mechanic that could unravel a superpower's grip on the entire world's money, and the choke point everyone is watching right now, from 3 ships bound for the Indies to an empire ruling millions. The East India Company proved money, left unchecked, writes its own laws. And that thread has never stopped running. From Lidenhall Street to today's headline, it is still the same story about who controls the money. A gilded thread ran from a shareholder's parlor in London straight through a burning field in Bengal. One ledger line, one famine. That's the mechanic, profit and power, once fused into a single company, answer to no crown until it's far too late. Thomas leans on his cane, eyebrows sharp. A corporation with its own army, ruling 200 million people, dissolved by one act of parliament in 1873 because London finally decided it was too big to be allowed to exist. Tell him below, could that happen again today? If this thread just changed how you read the news, that's the like button earning itself. Subscribe for the next thread, because the next headline hiding a 400-year-old mechanic is already waiting. Back on Leadenhall Street, the sign is long gone. But walk past that address today, and you're standing on the exact spot where a trading company once owned an empire. Proof the gilded thread never really breaks, it just finds a new company to run through.